Terrible Swift Sword, The 3 Days of Gettysburg. This was designed by a gentleman named Richard Berg. Some of you, if not most of you, should be familiar with. It was released in 1976. A number of versions of this was released. The original, which is what I have, is the SPI flat tray version. Now, I bought this second hand, so I'm not sure if it actually comes in 3 different trays or if the gentleman that I purchased this from just did that for better counter organization. Hard to say. Other versions do include, let's see, is there a soapbox version? And if so, is that the TSR version? Check my math there. TSR notable for picking up SPI titles, including but not limited to Barbarossa and Cobra, just to name a few. Again, they would make a habit of, they being TSR, of picking up SPI games and releasing them. Artist on this title is listed as Tom Darden, Larry Elmore, Ivor Johnsey, Redmond A. Simonson, an SPI staple, and the West Point Museum, so I'm assuming that has something to do with the map. Anything else we need to know credit-wise? By the way, welcome to another edition of Designer Notes. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so I thought I'd catch up. And I was looking for something on the shelf that has perhaps been forgotten, a little more obscure, something that folks may not tend to have access to. And this is what I came up with. So again, I do own this. In fact, I'm becoming inspired to put it on the table, possibly, so we'll see about that. What you get with this game is, actually, let's go over, you get a game map. So the game map is composed of 3 separate 22 by 34 inch map sheets, which, of course, when placed together, form the battlefield at Gettysburg. And I believe this is, let's look at the back of the thing here. 3 colors are incorporated in the map. Over 2,000 counters. Now, a number of these counters are going to be informational counters, so don't be daunted there. Another couple other key points, key selling points that they list is unit differentiated weapons effectiveness, 3 one-day scenarios, so your first, second, and third day, plus the full grand battle game. Alright, and for those of you that are nostalgic, of course, these old SPI games always had the proverbial, on the cover, the upper left, an historical simulation game with the time. In this case, the time is 0800 hours, the 1st of July, 1863, something they became noted for doing. And with the rules, it kind of comes with, this is turning more into a review, is it not? 32-page rule book, but that includes charts, things of that nature, scenarios, etc. But for purposes of this audio broadcast, we are concerning ourselves primarily with the designer's notes. And let's just hop right in, shall we? So it says, having made the initial decision to design a large, more introspective version of Gettysburg, the initial problems of size and scale were solved with relative ease. The original map was supposed to be 90 yards to the hex, but after a great deal of trial and error in drafting a test version, the present scale of 125 yards per hex was adopted. The differences between the two are minimal in their effect on the battle, and the latter scale was easier to work with. As for the terrain itself, several sources were used. Most of the terrain features came from the Bachelder 1876 map and the Civil War Times Illustrated Gettysburg Special Edition, as well as photos taken of the battlefield by Matthew Brady, Timothy O'Sullivan, and the Tyson brothers. In addition, our resident terrain expert, Terry Hardy, made a visit to the battlefield, trip heartily recommended to anyone with even the slightest interest in the period, and his observations proved invaluable as regards the unusual ridge and hill configurations and the lines of sight. And I will interject here that I have never been to the Gettysburg battlefield, nor, to my awareness or memory, have I been to any Civil War historical battlefield, but I have been to a number of reenactments at the Jefferson Barracks Park there in Missouri, where I grew up, which were very cool, very entertaining. Lost my place here. So that brings us to the terrain features that produced the biggest headaches were the unfinished railroad bed and the town of Gettysburg itself. For the former, we had to develop a unique set of rules that would recreate the unusual feature while not infringing on the basic line of sight rules. There is an excellent visualization of the bed in the American Heritage Civil War volume showing Chambersburg Pike and the railroad cut during the first day's fighting. The problems of the town were even more severe. Gettysburg proved to be more of a hindrance than a help to troops. Union regiments retreating through the town on the first day got lost for hours in the back streets and alleys, and a battle within the town most likely would have been a triumph of mass confusion. The rules for the town reflect this confusion and make it difficult for a player to use it either offensively or defensively. The following discussion refers to particular sections of the rules. Players might find that these comments, aside from providing insight into the design process, will help settle arguments about the meanings of certain rules. One of the initial design decisions made was that the game would favor the defense in general. In light of this decision, an intermixed play sequence, one where both players perform functions within a given player turn, was adopted. The placing of defensive fire before either offensive fire or melee enables the defensive player to stop an assault as or before it occurs, rather than waiting a turn. In addition, it was decided to give artillery its own fire phase in order to be able to recreate the tremendous artillery duels that marked the fighting at Gettysburg. The movement allowances for the units were determined by simple arithmetical computations based on rates of march, conditions of terrain, etc. However, these rates were then further adjusted for various reasons. For example, in the original version of the game, infantry units could either fire or move. Given the number of units in play and the general level of complexity, this was found to be quite unwieldy. Players simply could not keep track of who had done what. So the infantry movement allowance was lowered from 7 to 5, while the multiple for movement on pikes and roads was raised to allow for the adjustment to fire and move. The rate of movement for artillery on roads is not increased because of the generally poor conditions of the roads after the rains. The formation rules represent an amalgamation of the several different kinds of formations that were prevalent during the Civil War. Using all the available formations would have been impossible. In terms of playability, it simply was not feasible. In any case, while the rule may be somewhat abstract, for a designer to maintain his sanity, he must resign himself to a number of such abstractions. The practical effect is not. Changing a division into column and into a battle-ready fighting line is a definite problem in coordination and player command ability, as you will soon see. Thus, the problems of formation are covered more by the game's scale and movement rules than by the formation rules alone. A simple example of merging several rules to produce the desired effect. Stacking restrictions were, in general, formulated on unit frontage, statistics, and other such information. In addition, it was the designer's intention to avoid overlarge stacks on the game map. And I believe you can stack up to 8 strength points and or rather just 2 units, so minimal stacking allowance. I'm sure that there will be scholars who will challenge the generality of these particular rules, but within the strictures of the simulation and playability, they do accurately reflect the tactics of the period. This extension, let's see, is this correct? Yes. This extension of Case 8.2 simply reflects the realities of Civil War tactics and firepower. Reserve status enables players to store units on the game map, keeping them handy for reinforcing tight situations. The rules do reflect the status and combat readiness of units kept in such a situation. The entire design intent was based on the hypothesis that casualties would be taken accurately and historically. This meant step reduction for each unit. With some units containing as many as 800 men, it was decided to adopt a system first encountered by the designer in Desert Fox, that of having a separate counter representing the combat strength of the unit. This, together with the discovery that the four different combat values we were working with all drew from the same basic number, unit manpower, led to the present rule. The weapons range effects chart is the heart of the fire combat system, and ranges were determined through various sources and then adjusted for relativity to other weapons. For example, the seemingly large factor for Napoleonic muskets at 100 yards range arises from the fact that the Union soldiers carrying them had a tendency to load them with shot for close-up firing. They were brutal at close range. Information as to the types of small arms weapons carried by the various regiments was sketchy at best. One interesting factor that was unearthed was that few of the Confederate cavalry troopers were armed with more than pistols, while the standard Union issue was the Sharps carbine. If you as the player have information that so-and-so unit was armed with a certain type of weapon, feel free to change the given unit. An even more difficult job was typing Confederate artillery. They had a nasty habit of intermixing their batteries. Thus, the gun types for Confederate batteries represent, where possible, the prevalent gun. As for artillery in general, grape shot, regular shot, balls, etc., are all factored into the range effects chart. The reason for this is that testers invariably used grape at close range and shell at a distance. The two were thus placed on the same table, and the effect built into the range factor. The decision to separate small arms and artillery fire was reached when we decided that to add the two together would give an abnormally large effect to artillery against infantry at 400 to 500 yards. Then he goes on to state, I could never understand why units in a game could not split their fire. This rule reflects that concern, referring to a specific rule in 10.34. It also reflects the realities of regimental frontage and firepower. Thus, this rule proved to be quite popular with playtesters, and line of sight rules are the bête noire of any designer. No matter how well they are written, there is always someone who can't make head nor tail of them. Something to do with the structural visualization. TSS has adopted a three-tiered line of sight system, and since all line of sight rules are an abstraction, players in a pinch will simply have to use their common sense. Surprisingly, line of sight problems were relatively few during playtesting. Let's hope they stay that way. The reasoning behind the increased value of cavalry units for victory points is centered on their cost to train and replace, resulting in a reluctance by commanders to commit them to a massive engagement. Historically, Buford's two brigades lost only 127 men that first day, and even then they were withdrawn. The fire combat results table is a result of trial and error, research and playtesting, with an emphasis on the latter. The main wish was to produce, quote, accurate, end quote, casualties. The usual result had to, quote, numbers and losses, etc., but it was only after several weeks of counting bodies that a workable combat results table was added. The pinned result was added late in playtesting to compensate for adjustments made to losses from artillery fire, etc. Withdrawal and retreat fire were also fairly late additions resulting from playtesting. It was found that the elimination of the standard form of zone of control allowed units too much movement leeway. There was a definite desire to stay away from the fire system used in Torgau, so a compromise was reached in the above two rules. The supply rules, both basic and optional, were given a great deal of thought and attention. The numerical quotas used, especially in the optional rules, were arrived at through a series of calculations based on information culled from various sources, including personal statements by both artillery commanders, Hunt and Pendleton, as to the state of ammunition supply. As stated in the rules, even the optional rule is somewhat abstract, and it may seem strange that the same, quote, round, end quote, of ammunition can supply a battery of 6 guns as well as it can a battery of 2 guns. But this was all worked out arithmetically, and if it seems a bit hazy to us now, I know it was right when we first did it. Loss of ammunition by small arms units was a terrible reality during the battle. The rule in the game is not literally accurate in a truly realistic sense, but it does simulate the situation without resorting to an incredibly complex system of charts and tables, which was tried and, believe me, did not work any better. It was decided quite early to place melee combat within the hex. This solved a great number of terrain problems, and created a much more realistic readout from the melee combat results table. It enabled us to rationalize captured results without any qualms, and it simulated assaults in a much more visual fashion. The reason for using a combat differential rather than the usual odds ratio was that in using the latter, we found that almost every melee was 1-to-1. Combat differential proved to be more valid in terms of the relative size of the units involved. The route rules may seem somewhat simplistic in the use of unit size to determine susceptibility to rout. They are, in reality, not. Since routing was almost invariably a result of a percentage of losses, as opposed to an absolute number, the size of the unit would have a definite bearing on rout. And 4 paragraphs left here. The leader rules were formulated with a specific design intent to keep as much play in the hands of the gamers as possible. The true effect of leaders is to keep the basic brigade formations in formation. The rather complex system of officers and commanders grew out of that idea. The ratings for the individual leaders are admittedly somewhat subjective, but then again, so is all interpretation of history. Players might note that the quote stars and bird colonel end quote rankings used for all leaders was not actually used by the South. Confederate general officers used braiding to distinguish themselves from colonels, etc. The somewhat severe restrictions on the ability of cavalry to make a mounted charge reflected the great decline in the effect of cavalry in such a massive battle. The effect of ranged fire on cavalry was deadly, especially considering the drill a cavalry brigade had to go through before it could mount a charge. I know some of you are fond of saying cavalry, although you're supposed to say cavalry. I here henceforth propose a compromise. Cavalry. Our resistance to putting in this bit of, and that was my interjection, our resistance to putting in this bit of esoteria was low. I'm not sure it was ever used in the entire 4 months of playtesting, but it sure sounds great, and that's again in relation to a rule that I haven't specified. Finally, the BCE rule was almost a must after the amount of playtesting we observed. Most players had no regard for the number of men they were killing. The objective was all important. This, of course, did not accurately reflect the usage and capabilities of the various brigades during the battle. Thus, the BCE rule was promulgated after considerable research into the various brigades, etc. Granted, takes a deal of bookkeeping, but it is quite realistic and will give the players a much greater feel for tactics of the era than using the rather simplistic demoralization rules. That concludes the designer notes. Some of those may have seemed a little confusing, and again, that is because it is in direct response to a specific rule. So, for instance, 26.0 that I just read in relation to the BCE rule would be read directly after familiarizing yourself with 26.0, which BCE does stand for Brigade Combat Effectiveness. And then it goes into how that works, etc. Alright, that was the designer notes for Terrible Swift Sword 3 days, the 3 days of Gettysburg. No shortage of Gettysburg games. In fact, we have yet another one coming from Flying Pig. Most Fearful Sacrifice, I believe. Watched a couple reviews of this. I do like some of the mechanics it incorporates. I will add, and this is just a me thing, the Rick Barber map, and I know a lot of you guys love Rick Barber map. I don't care for it in respect to what it represents. It strikes me more as like a role-playing Middle Earth vibe type map, but I know that's heresy to a lot of you. Those of you that live, breathe, and die Rick Barber, I get it. I understand. But in this particular instance, it just doesn't work for me. Nevertheless, this concludes our designer's notes for Terrible Swift Sword. Join us again next time for an unspecified episode of Designer Notes. Thanks for listening and stay safe.